Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We're ready to get started now. Thank you all very much for joining us today at this press conference at the Palais des Nations. We're pleased to have with us today all three members of the independent international fact-finding mission for the Sudan, who wanted to take this opportunity to speak to you about the findings of their latest report. With us in the center is the chair, Mr. Mohamed Chande Othman. To my right is Ms. Joy Ngozi Ezeilo, and on the far side is Ms. Mona Rishmawi. As you may know, the fact-finding mission was created by the Human Rights Council in October 2023 to investigate and establish the facts, circumstances, and root causes of all alleged human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law in the context of the conflict that began in April 2023. Their latest report was published online this morning. It will be officially presented to the Human Rights Council at the start of next week. And now I hand over to the chair for opening remarks, followed by our fellow experts, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning. Let me, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, by way of introduction, just reiterate that following our establishment by the Human Rights Council on 11th of October 2023, the independent international fact-finding mission for the Sudan commenced its work, and we are expecting on the 10th of September to present our report to the Human Rights Council. To begin with, I think it is important to reiterate that the work of a commission like ours requires cooperation and consultation, and in the conduct of our in-depth investigation, we have undertaken 128 in-depth interviews with individuals, and also following our call for submissions, we received over 700 submissions from various entities and organizations, individuals, experts, and so on. So our findings are based on very wide consultations. Another distinctive feature of this commission is cooperation with Sudan. Despite 4 requests that we made between January and August this year for meetings and access to Sudan, unfortunately the Sudanese authority have not engaged with our mandate to date. However, we will continue to pursue these efforts and remain open to engaging with all the parties to the conflict. But we have also engaged neighboring states, and we have received access to Kenya, where our secretariat is based, Chad and Uganda, and we continue also to request access to Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, which is crucial also in gaining additional first-hand information and therefore also to effectively carry on this mandate. But in terms of the requirements of Resolution 54.2, it had also required us to engage with many other entities that are involved in the Sudan conflict and the Sudanese situation. So we have worked closely with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and his designated experts on Sudan, the United Nations Security Council panel of experts on Sudan, the UN Secretary General's personal envoy for Sudan, the Sudan country representative of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, including also the AU Special Envoy for the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide and Mass Associated Crimes. Our mandate, however, and at this we want to insist, is separate and distinct in scope than the other mandates, but coordination is necessary of course, to avoid overlap and duplication of efforts. In discharging our mandate, we have also had extensive consultation with Sudanese civil society organizations, community leaders, human rights defenders, subject matter experts, and other stakeholders. And we want to thank all organizations and individuals that have extended their hands, and also for those who have recounted the harrowing stories of the conflict. Now, let me turn to the conflict. Since mid-April 2023, the conflict in Sudan has spread to 14 out of the 18 states, impacting the entire country and the region, leaving 8 million Sudanese internally displaced as a result of the conflict, with over 2 million who have been forced to flee to neighboring countries. That makes a total of 10 million people either displaced or in refugee status outside Sudan. Over 105 countries in this world have a population of less than 10 million. So you could see the impact that has in terms of a devastating effect. But I think also it is our view and our finding that the conflict remains protracted. It has engulfed, as we said, the whole of territory, affecting the whole of Sudan. And there are more than two warring parties, because both the two parties rely on allied militia and other irregular forces. So the true scale, however, is yet to be known due to the ongoing conflict, where there are many thousands of civilian men, women, and children who have been killed or who have been wounded and have suffered extensively. Turning to our finding, we have found that the Sudanese warring parties, that mainly the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, and their respected allies have committed an appalling range of violations. And as my fellow expert, Mona Rishmawi, will further detail, we found reasonable grounds to believe that many of these violations amount to international crimes. Violations established took different forms based on intersecting grounds including gender and age, and their impact will last for decades to come. Urgent assistance is needed, in particular to survivors of rape and other forms of sexual violence, including children, as my fellow expert, Joy Ngozi Ezeilo, will explain. The gravity of our findings and failure of the warring parties to protect civilians underscores the need for urgent and immediate intervention. Our report, therefore, calls and recommends for the deployment of an independent, impartial force to protect civilians in the country. We also call again on both sides to comply with their obligations under international law and immediately, unconditionally cease all attacks on the civilian population. The people of Sudan have suffered greatly, and the violations against them must stop. This cannot be done without ending the fighting, and all efforts must therefore be invested in reaching a sustainable ceasefire that would also enable the effective delivery of much-needed humanitarian assistance. While we welcome the reopening of the Adre border crossing between Chad and Sudan, we also found that both parties have obstructed humanitarian access, leading to a severe escalation of the humanitarian crisis. We call on all sides to abide by international humanitarian law and the Jeddah Declaration commitments to provide unrestricted access to humanitarian aid providers to all areas of the Sudan. We therefore call for the expansion of the existing embargo in Darfur pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 1556 of 2004 and subsequent resolutions to cover now the whole of the Sudan, to stem the supply of weapons, ammunition, and other logistics or financial support. We call on all states to abide by their international legal obligations under the arms embargo and reiterate, or rather caution, that those supplying arms may be complicit in serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. I now invite my fellow expert, Ngozi Ezeilo, to continue.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Specifically on women and children, conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan has a long and tragic history, often used as a weapon of war to terrorize and control communities. In the context of the current conflict, civilians, an overwhelming majority of whom are women and children, women and girls, were and continue to be targeted with sexual violence, in particular rape, gang rape, by both parties to the conflict. Members of the RSF, in particular, have perpetrated sexual violence on a large scale in the context of attacks on cities in Darfur region and the greater Khartoum area. Victims recounted being attacked in their homes, beaten, lashed, and threatened with death or harm to their relatives or children before being raped by more than one perpetrator. They were also subjected to sexual violence while seeking shelter from attacks or fleeing. We also found evidence of women being subjected to sexual slavery after being abducted by RSF members. We also documented several cases of sexual violence, including rape and rape threats attributed to SAF and its military intelligence, and received information concerning allegations of sexual exploitation of women and girls by SAF in exchange for food in areas under their control. However, further investigations are necessary to determine the extent and the patterns of sexual violence perpetrated by SAF in the context of the current conflict. There are no comprehensive statistics of sexual and gender-based violence in Sudan. Sexual violence is also largely underreported due to social and cultural barriers, fear or stigma and reprisals. An inadequate domestic legal framework, as well as the impact of the conflict on communication, security, and access to health services. Data received from confidential sources shows that at least 400 rape survivors sought assistance to service providers during the first year of the conflict, with the real figure being probably much higher. Active conflict and widespread presence of armed fighters, multiple displacement, frequent communication blackouts, and the collapse of the health system in several parts of the country severely hampers the possibility of survivors of sexual violence to report an incident and receive support. Survivors also describe the long-lasting consequences of sexual violence on their physical and mental health and their social isolation. Such violence also carries long-term social impact on families and communities. Children are also being recruited and used in hostilities, killed, injured, abducted, and forcibly displaced, detained with adults, tortured, subjected to sexual violence, and deprived of health care and education. Many have also witnessed their parents, siblings, friends, neighbors subjected to the most heinous crime. The rare brutality of this war will have a devastating and long-lasting psychological impact on children in Sudan. The peace process will need to prioritize and adequately address the concerns and need of children to prevent Sudan being drawn into ongoing cycle of violence. We found that SAF is responsible for killing and maiming of children and attacks on schools or hospitals during airstrikes. We also received credible information that SAF played a role in the training and arming of children who have joined the popular mobilization. We found that boys were arrested and held in RSF and SAF detention facilities in Khartoum together with male detainees and subjected to acts of torture. We found that RSF is responsible for recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence against children, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals, notably in Darfur, Khartoum, or Al Jazeera state. It also found that boys were arrested and held in RSF detention facilities in Khartoum and Darfur, together with male detainees, and subjected to acts of torture and sexual violence. I will now turn over to my colleague, Mona, to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to the findings of our fact-finding mission. As mentioned by my colleagues, our investigation have found that both parties and their respective allies have committed large-scale violations of human rights and international humanitarian law since the start of conflict in mid-April 2023. Many of these amount to international crimes. In particular, we have found that both SAF and RSF conducted hostilities in densely populated areas, in particular through constant strikes and artillery shellings in different cities, including Khartoum and different cities in Darfur, amongst others, while failing to take sufficient measures to minimize the impact on the civilian population. We have found that civilian infrastructure and objects, including homes, schools, hospitals, water and electricity supplies, and communication networks indispensable for the survival of the civilian population, were attacked, damaged, or destroyed by both sides. Both sides also engaged in a pattern of arbitrary detention and torture, sometimes including sexual violence and rape, as my colleague mentioned. Those documenting the violations or assisting survivors, including legal and medical professionals, as well as civil society members, were also targeted. Internet shutdown and impediment of humanitarian access in various forms, including administrative restrictions and insecurity, the looting of humanitarian aid, and the attacks on humanitarian workers also were conducted by both sides. The RSF and its militias further committed a large-scale ethnic-based attacks on the non-Arab civilian population, in particular the Masalites in Al Janena and around it in West Darfur. This attack, which we documented very rigorously, comprised of horrific assaults, including killings, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, destruction of property, and pillage. On this basis, and on the basis of the above, we found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both SAF and RSF and their respective allies have committed the war crimes of violence against life and person, in particular murder of all kinds, mutilation, cruel treatment and torture, and committing outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliation and degrading treatment. We further found that the RSF and its allies committed the additional war crimes of rape and sexual slavery, and any forms of indecent attacks, pillage of towns and places, conscripting or enlisting of children under the age of 15, or using them to participate actively in hostilities, intentionally directing attacks against civilian population, and ordering the displacement of civilian populations for reasons related to the conflicts. We also found that the RSF and its allied militias committed crimes against humanity, namely murder, torture, enslavement, rape, sexual slavery, acts of sexual nature, of comparative gravity, persecution on the basis of intersecting ethnicity and gender grounds, and forcible displacement of the population. Given the gravity of these violations and amounting to international crimes, and the dire need to break a cycle of impunity that Sudan has been engulfed with for many, many years, and to deliver justice to victims and survivors and their families, and to the affected communities as a whole, criminal responsibility for all violations is key. Therefore, we believe that the Sudanese authorities must first and foremost, cooperate with the International Criminal Court and surrender all those indicted persons, including former President Omar Bashir, to the International Criminal Court. We also call on the Security Council, as the chair just mentioned, to expand the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction under Resolution 1593 of 2005, to cover the entire country of Sudan. We further call for the urgent establishment of a separate international judicial mechanism, working in tandem and complementarity with the International Criminal Court to ensure accountability of all perpetrators at all levels. Our findings should serve as a wake-up call to the international community to take decisive action to support survivors and their families and the affected communities, and to hold the perpetrators to account. Therefore, we have also heard from Sudanese stakeholders about the overwhelming and the immediate need for assistance to survivors to the conflict, we call for the establishment of a victim support and reparations office to assist the victims of these conflicts. We shouldn't only focus on the perpetrators. The victims live in extremely dire situation, extremely difficult situation, in refugee camps, in IDP camps across the country and outside the country. They need our help and assistance, and therefore we need a separate entity dedicated to their support. I thank you, and we are happy to take questions.
For further clarity, I think you know very well that independent fact-finding missions, their methodology and their reach is quite important. And we, as a fact-finding mission, relied on initially secondary sources, but we relied on 182 in-depth, one-to-one interviews with witnesses, and out of the 182 witnesses, for precision, 117 men and 67 women that form part of the findings of the fact-finding mission for the Sudan. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for the opening remarks. Now we'll start with the questions. If you could please identify yourself and the media outlet you work for. Please go ahead in the front.
Good morning. Thank you for the press conference. My name is Christophe Vogt. I work for Agence France Presse. I have quite a few questions, but the first one is on this independent and impartial force that you're asking for. Can you give us a little bit more on that? First of all, where would it come from? What size would it have to have? And do you think that, given the context, there is a chance that it could actually be put into place? And then I had another question on how can I phrase that? So what you described in Sudan is basically the worst conflict that we have right now in the world, given the violations of international law, the scale. So I was just wondering, why do you think that there is so little talk about this conflict? And maybe just a last one is, there are a lot of difficulties with UN finances. The budgets are very scarce. Do you have the means you need to accomplish your mission? Thank you.
Maybe just very briefly on the international force, and I think the colleagues can. There are different models, of course. I mean, this can be done by the United Nations, and there has been, in the neighboring country in South Sudan, there is actually, a mandate for the United Nations to protect civilians in particular countries. This can also be done, as we know from also the African Union. So regional organizations can actually do that. But also it can be done as part of an agreement of a peace process. It can be done in different formats. So the most important message that we want to say here is that the parties do not appear to be given sufficient attention to the protection of civilians. Protection of civilians is paramount and very important. People are moving from one area to another, attacked, sheltered, bombarded, facing rape and torture at checkpoints. It's very difficult situation inside the country. And outside the country, some of the actors are actually still also operating in refugee camps in different areas. So honestly, the Sudanese people, we are talking about 46 plus million people. They cannot be left on their own to face facing these two warring parties. So from our side, there are, of course, there is a need for a political will, an international political will, to protect the civilians in Sudan if the warring parties are not caring enough about them. And this is really our message here.
Just also to speak to the question about how come so little is said about this war. I mean, that's really, and coming from Africa, that has been a big question. And people worry that is it because of the continent or Africa and the past conflict that is ridden with conflict? Why is so little heard about this conflict? That we are thousands of people have died, and not just died, famine of millions of people. As we speak, people are eating grasses, sand, to stay alive. Children are malnourished, they are dying. People are unable to bury their loved ones in cultures that places a lot of emphasis on such. And yet, so little is known about this conflict in the world. Having done some field missions and being in Chad and traveling widely and meeting refugees, and thousands of them live professionals now destitute, living in foreign lands, not knowing when this will end. It's really heartbreaking. And I think definitely the world needs to do much more than this. And linking this to resources, a lot of lack of resources, even for host countries that are hosting refugees like Chad. And international community must do more to treat all cases of conflict and victims of displacement and death. That's why accountability is important, but again, the response of the international community. And this must be on the front burner of international discussion.
Just on the resources aspect, we have a contingent of about 12 or 13 full-time staff at the Fact-Finding Mission Secretariat, which is based in Nairobi at the UN office. Of course, it is less than the 19 staff or so that was approved by the budget. So 2/3 of the staff are on board, which really enable us, I think, in the last 3.5, 4 months, to be able to collect this information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Let's take a question from the very back. Please go ahead.
My name is Annegret Matari. I'm working for several Swiss news agencies. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't seen you. May I?
It's okay, you started.
Okay. You are also asking for separate international judicial mechanism. What are you thinking of, or which institution should create this, the Security Council? And are you thinking of a special tribunal? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In our report, we explore, because our mandate asked us to do that, we explore options. We say what is on the table. We basically put all the various models, and we will be doing this more and more. We will put the models out there, in separate papers, in separate issues. So what we can say is that right now there is a jurisdiction in Sudan, which is the International Criminal Court. This jurisdiction is limited to one area in Darfur related to the conflict that happened 20 years ago. Now, the conflict is ongoing and engulfing now most of Sudan. We cannot conclude that there are international crimes committed and say you cannot do anything about it. There has to be accountability. And the accountability can take two forms. Expanding the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court to cover all the territory of Sudan. That is very important. But as we know, and we know very well from practice of the International Criminal Court so far, it is focusing on the most responsible. It will not touch the person who raped that woman in a particular detention center in Niala or Al Janina or this. These people need to be held to account. The fact that they were not held to account in previous conflicts, it's what made women's body as a theater of operation for this war. This has to stop. And the only way to stop is to have an international judicial mechanism because there is no confidence, unfortunately, although Sudan has excellent lawyers and excellent judges. Unfortunately, the judiciary has been so politicized and so divided, taking part, that there is no confidence at this stage. So you need a judicial mechanism. How it will be established, this is something that we need to work on, and we need to look at different possibilities, different models. It can be a separate international court completely, like Rwanda, Yugoslavia, all this stuff. It can be a hybrid court with Sudanese and internationals. It could be a special court, like what happened in Sierra Leone. But the most important thing is that the trust in the current system, unfortunately in Sudan, it has been so polarized that there is no trust in the national system. And that's really very unfortunate. Sudan deserves better, and it has better. So it deserves much better.
Thank you. Let's go to the very back, and then we can go to Reuters first, and then in the front. Please go ahead.
Bodhi Hooker, Phoenix TV from Hong Kong. Regarding your last answers, you know, in the August, the United States organized a meeting of humanitarian with several countries, but this meeting doesn't real focus on the ceasefire or arms embargo. So what do you feel about the Sahel mission? And how do you think the international community could help or could affect the kind of the ceasefire and protecting civilians? Thank you.
Yes, I think there are a lot of efforts in terms of trying to bring the parties to the negotiation table. And in our view, those efforts should continue. They should be relentless, much as the parties have hesitancy in terms of having direct-to-direct negotiation. But there are many ways of negotiating for peace. And I think our report encourages that one, but also encourages a consolidation of the efforts. There are many, many efforts by the African Union. There are efforts by IGAD. There are efforts by the US and Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. But I think and also under the auspices of the Secretary General Special Envoy. And those efforts, I think, need consolidation. But I think any party or any state that has an influence on the parties to the conflict, I think they must also play a role in convincing the parties to the negotiating table, because I think there is consensus really that the hostilities must end, that there will be no winner in this conflict, and that the best way is really for a peaceful settlement, however painful it might be to any of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll take a question from Emma Farge from Reuters.
Hi, good morning. I was wondering if you could give us a bit more of an idea of what you had in mind on the expanded arms embargo and why the current one isn't working. And then, Joy, would you please elaborate a bit more on the sexual violence by both sides? I understood that both sides have committed that, but you have more evidence, I think, against the RSF. If you could just elaborate a bit more and the scale of sexual slavery by the RSF. And finally, just a clarification, you mentioned that you had reached out to the Sudanese authorities to get a response, to get their engagement, but you didn't say whether you'd reached out to the RSF. I was wondering if you had tried that and what sort of engagement you got from them, if any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we noted, the issue of rape and the other forms of sexual violence, especially against women and children, are very rampant. And we had and we met firsthand also victims and survivors, including service providers that have tried within the limited resources and in very difficult circumstances to assist survivors. And we know that we got more evidence. There is more evidence with regard to acts of rape and sexual violence committed by RSF, and then also some pointing also to SAF. Then, just like we documented, about 400 we gathered, or even more, from service providers. But we think, and they of course, from the interlocutors, that most of them are not reported. And that some also got pregnant because, of course, we know about the stigma, the fear of even reprisals, of mentioning names, the shame, the shame that comes with it, also impedes reporting. And again, even for women that ordinarily some reproductive health services should be available in hospitals, the hospitals are under attacks, infrastructure, and they can't access the health care they need. So for now, in our conclusion, both sides, and then, but then in terms of gathering evidence, and we still think that we need to deep dig with regards to sexual violence committed by SAF, but we have preponderance of evidence with regard to RSF. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a question from the front. Please go ahead.
Sorry, if I
sure.
may, there was just something left hanging. The first one was on the arms embargo. And then, sorry, on the RSF, if they're engaged with the committee. Thank you.
Yeah, on the arms embargo, I think you know that the arms embargo covers Darfur. It's been going on for many years. It's a one-year mandate. In fact, the current one ends on the 12th of September, which is next week. And it has been effective somehow. But we think that since the conflict in Darfur is related to, it cannot be separate from the conflict in other parts of the Sudan, that the starving the parties of arms and ammunition, including new supplies of ammunition and arms, will help in slowing down their appetite for hostilities. So therefore, if you leave open the rest of Sudan and leave only an arms embargo in Darfur, is not sufficient because of the permeability, of the movement of forces. And we know that in this conflict, the warring parties are moving from region to region, beginning from Khartoum, Omdurman, Darfur, and now extending to 14 out of the 18 states. So we think that that also is something that should be worth consider. Of course, cooperation with RSF. The RSF had approached the President of the Human Rights Council to express their readiness to cooperate with us. And we, at the Secretariat level, have begun engaging at least with their legal officers or legal offices, and we remain open really to engage with the parties in order to remind them of their obligation, but also they have a responsibility really in terms of in our oral update we called on the parties, for example, in April this year, for the parties to issue directives to their troops to respect international human rights and humanitarian law. So I think we will continue to engage with the parties and to remind them of their obligations under international law and international human rights law. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the front.
Taha Youssef, I work freelancer for Middle East media outlets. I have two questions. Why did you make your report from inside Sudan? Why you didn't make it inside of Sudan? You make it for outside of Sudan. Okay, and you have mentioned that on your report, countries must stop providing arms to the conflict parties. Did you talk with these countries? Because Sudanese people has been talking about UAE, United Arab Emirates, as a provider of arms to RSF.
Yeah, two things. One, you know that Sudan opposes the mandate, but it is our obligation as an independent international fact-finding mission to continue to seek the cooperation of the state concerned, which is Sudan. So we have, since our establishment, made official requests, I think 4 in all, to meet with Sudanese authority, to visit Sudan. So Sudan does not cooperate with us, but cooperation or non-cooperation, fact-finding missions continue to do their work because there are methodologies that arrive at sound, evidence-based findings and conclusions. But we will continue, as I said, to seek the cooperation of Sudan. With regard to neighboring states, we have done the same, and we are happy that Chad, and we had an extended 3-week mission by our investigation team and ourselves to Chad. We were able to collect a lot of material, a lot of evidence, and so on. We were in Kenya, in Nairobi, we were in Uganda also, but also we seek. There are other neighboring countries, I think, which are very, very important. South Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, Central African Republic, that we have approached, and we'll continue to urge them to cooperate, because access is essential. Also for us, it's very important to tell a full story. And we know that Sudanese refugees, the 2 million that we say, are in all these countries. So it's important for us really to have access, to be able to, as much as possible, tell the story of each and every person. Yeah, concerning the arms embargo, our mandate does not specifically ask us to investigate the supply of arms. There is a UN Security Council panel that deals with that in respect to Darfur. And our report is evidence-based. I think if there was evidence-based on the standards required for our report, by another independent body, we will be able to consider it. So we are open to any information to that effect. We are aware, for example, some countries like EU has taken some measures in terms of sanctioning and so on, and the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee and so forth. So I think we are open to do that. But what our focus really is that the supply of arms in Sudan and ammunition in Sudan is one of the factors that continues to fuel the conflict, and therefore that should be addressed. And in our modest contribution, we think that that arms embargo should cover the whole of the Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple questions from online. I don't know is Jamie Keaton there? If not, let's go to Lawrence Sierro first from the Swiss News Agency, and we'll come back to Jamie if he gets back. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. A bunch of quick questions. First, there is only a brief mention in the report about the siege of El Fasher by RSF. How would you qualify that as a crime? And then same thing for starvation. I just see a brief mention of starvation, voluntary starvation. How would you qualify that as a crime as well? And the third would be coming back to the independent force that you would like to be set up. Are you calling today concretely the UN Security Council to call for a session where they should consider Chapter 7? Thank you.
Thank you very much. With regard to Al Fasher, let me start with this, with the hunger and famine in Al Fasher. It's not a small thing that the IPC actually came to the conclusion that there is a panel. This is a high, there is famine. This is a high threshold that unfortunately in the case of Sudan, it has been met. The Security Council called on the siege of Al Fasher to end. This hasn't really been respected, and this is extremely serious that the city that is hosting thousands and thousands of people, perhaps million, is under siege in the way it is. From our side, of course, starvation is very serious. It needs to be fully documented. We haven't gone to the issue of whether this famine and the starvation as a method of starvation as could constitute war crime and crime against humanity, if you want. We in our investigation have touched on these issues, and we do say that the siege by itself is really putting the humanitarian, the civilian population at a very, very serious risk. We need to look more into it in terms of the deliberate policies, in terms of the, prohibition of the intention, basically, to starve the civilian population. We need to look a lot more into this. But from what we are seeing right now, it's an extremely worrying situation. And it compounds other war crimes and crimes against humanity that are being committed right now. So it's a very, very serious situation. In terms of the international force, as I said, there are several options. I don't want us to basically say, okay, we call on one entity to do something because this entity could be the right format or the wrong format, because we know the political situation in the world today. What I think what is important is the end result. The end result is the civilian population in Sudan need protection, and this is not happening today. There are projections on the famine with very stark numbers by the end of this year, and this cannot continue. We cannot continue to have people dying in front of our eyes and we do nothing about it. So that's really, so we are not going to go into this one entity. There are several institutions that have direct responsibility to actually stop what is going on in Sudan, and one of them is definitely the Security Council, but it's not only the Security Council. Others have a role as well.
Thank you. Let's go to Jamie Keaton from Associated Press online.
Thanks, Todd, and thank you to the fact-finding mission members. It seems to me that that the fighting sides have largely ignored all these calls for a halt to the conflict and for respect for civilians and other things. But maybe the international community will be a little bit more receptive. Your report makes no reference to which countries should be held accountable for possible complicity in war crimes or crimes against humanity. So could you please tell us which countries you have in mind, and why do you not specify those countries in the report? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. As we said, our report is based on the evidence that we have collected. Okay, and we have, in terms of allocating individual responsibility, individuals and entities, and we have dossiers also that we have opened in terms of those we think should be held accountable. But of course, in an investigation like this, it is still at a lower threshold in terms of really accusing anybody. We are not an accusatory body or prosecutorial body. We are an investigative body that has collected evidence, and our report says clearly that we have individual and entities responsible have been identified in dossiers prepared for that.
Thank you. Just like the chair said, we are fact-finding, independent international fact-finding mission, and there is the evidence that we gather that forms, help us to form some conclusion and recommendation. We are very, very eager to see an end to the hostilities, and you're right in pointing out that various parties have ignored all the calls for ceasefire. But we must continue to push for accountability. And in our report and recommendation, we made it very clear that protection of civilians is paramount, and importantly, that those who are complicit in the supply of arms may also be implicated in terms of war crimes and crime against humanity, because once you establish that chain, and we are still working and investigating, and we have to collaborate with other agencies, including ICC, and if we have those kind of evidence, we will also pass it on to the appropriate quarters that can take it further in terms of prosecution. But it's important to continue to emphasize that the supply of weapons, ammunition, or other logistical assistance, or even financial assistance to the warring parties, those doing that run a risk of also being held accountable for violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one last question from Jeremy Lange. We'll have to be quick because we have to wrap this up in about 3 minutes. So please, Jeremy, go ahead.
I'll be super quick. It's just technical details. I'd like to make sure I got this right. Both sides are accused of having committed war crimes. But when it comes to crimes against humanity, the report is mentioning more the RSF than the Sudanese armed forces. Do you correct me if I'm wrong? But this is what I read, and the same thing for the recruitment of child soldiers. When I read the report, it seems that again RSF been accused of recruiting child soldiers, but when I hear the press briefing, I think I heard a bit earlier that the Sudanese armed forces have also recruited child soldiers. So can you just clarify that for me? Thank you.
No, thank you very much for the question. I just want to actually point you to the relevant paragraphs in the report, which is paragraph, sorry, I'm just here. I'll get it in a second. Basically, what we are saying is that there are war crimes by both sides, particularly on bombardment and shelling, and indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population, as well as torture. In addition, there are crimes against humanity, meaning there are intentional policies, attacks against the civilian population, particularly by RSF. And then we name quite a few, which I outlined them in my intervention. For particularly sexual slavery, ethnic-based killings in Al Janina against the Masalites, and persecution, and so on. With regard to the recruitment of children, don't forget we are talking about the allied forces. The allied forces themselves have engaged, and both sides have engaged in recruitment of children. So there are forces allied to SAF itself. SAF is mobilizing, and sometimes is mobilizing in schools. But its allied forces have been recruiting children and have been using children in combat. And that's where the distinction that you find in our report. It is much more systematic and widespread on the base by RSF, but also, unfortunately, and that has to stop because SAF made a lot of commitments. The government of Sudan made commitments, including when it ratified the optional protocol on the use of children in conflict. It made commitments that it will not, neither, even on voluntary basis, it will not even accept volunteers under 18. Right now, the situation is very different. So that's what we are saying, if you want.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have to wrap this up. If you have any follow-up questions, please contact me directly. We'll get you in touch with the experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.